What's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Shrek Forever After from 2010. I know this is also called Shrek Forever After the Final Chapter, and Shrek the Final Chapter, and Shrek Forever After 3D, and just Shrek 4. It's the fourth Shrek, basically. Shrek Forever After is kind of in a weird place because it is kind of sort of after the Shrek wave, you could say. It is post the hugeness of the third one. DreamWorks was sort of different by the time this came out. Culturally, Shrek was not as big as he once was, but it wasn't a meme yet, and no one can really be nostalgic for something that is not even 10 years old. It was 9 years old, but still. But I do think it understood the character and what a Shrek movie is, and who the character of Shrek is much better than the third one. And I think that's kind of why this gets sort of a mixed reaction, because in some places it is very much like a works within what a Shrek movie should be, but on the other hand, it also feels like a studio that has kind of moved past its need for a franchise like Shrek artistically, even though, financially this still did really well. Because ultimately, like, the plot of this movie is, an It's a Wonderful Life type thing, or, the whole idea of if you were removed from your time period, the world, in your mind, you would be better, your life would be better, everyone else would be better without you. Although I actually think it'd be more interesting if that actually did turn out to be true, because in all these, it's like everything's worse, and it was like, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't exist. Like, what if everything was better? I always never understand why they always do like it's like when you see that Muppets thing where 9/11 wouldn't have happened if Kermit didn't exist. Anyway, I think about that all the time. It's like, what if that is actually true? That's got to be true for somebody. I mean, it's like some random person who's like, oh man, maybe it was actually detrimental for me to be around. However, that's not how this works. Shrek is basically is getting sick of being a dad, being a father, having all these responsibilities, having a constant, like, kids screaming responsibilities, the kind of endless circle of life of Donkey and Puss in Boots coming over, telling the story of how Fiona and Shrek got together again and again, and kind of loses it at a birthday party, says to Fiona, which I think was way too far, hey, we should have never gotten together, this sucks. Basically, which I was like, whoa, Shrek, you could just say, can I just get drunk with my buddies next week? You didn't need to go that far. But he does, and then he makes a wish with Rumpelstiltskin to have a day, one day like an ogre like he used to be, and he has to give up basically a day from his past, and he's like, just pick a day when you were a baby, and Rumpelstiltskin picks the day he was born, and so Shrek doesn't exist, and it would be what happened if Shrek doesn't exist, basically. You find out what happened to Donkey, Fiona, who's running an org army, Donkey's just like dirty and singing for witches, and Puss in Boots is fat, which is not, Antonio Banderas plays well, but not like my favorite. I'm not totally against fat jokes if you can get them to work, but anyway. It shows like kind of what works with the Shrek character, which is, I don't want to do this thing. I kind of deny responsibility most of the time, but I am forced into doing, saving my swamp, and I have to save all these other people to save my swamp, so I guess I'm like going to be responsible and do all this stuff. I don't want to deal with, Shrek 2 is like, I don't want to deal with my girlfriend's stupid parents and stuff, but she's really into it and I really love her, so I'm going to go into this, and like, he does. I think that's what works about Shrek and these films, is like, he is a character who does not want to be there, basically, but he does it, and he takes on that responsibility even begrudgingly. And so the last one where he's like, I don't want to be king, so I'll get this other guy to this thing, was like too convoluted and complicated, and honestly I think like kind of messed that up. It's like, I sort of get what you were thinking, but that's not what that's not what works about him. He had to have like, it sort of has to be a universal sort of thing, like a feeling of, I don't want to be bothered with this, but I have to do this, even though deep down inside, much like Layers of an Onion or whatever, Shrek actually does care, but he begrudgingly on the outside cares. And so on this one, I think they sort of mix up 3 and the previous 1 and 2 with his actions, because he's like, I don't want to be, all this stuff of being a dad is too much for me, and I want to go back to seeing what it was like before. And it's like, he is denying responsibility, but then when he gets stuck in that, he takes on that responsibility to do it, but he's not as begrudging. So it's sort of like Yes, it's more true to the character in that point because I do think you sort of need that for the character. And it does feel like the guy who would be begrudging about those sort of things would take that deal for Rumpelstiltskin, so I don't think it is entirely out of the ordinary, but it sort of messes it up because as soon as he sees the consequences of his actions, he's not begrudgingly changing everything back, which honestly would have been funnier. Feels like, I mean, I guess I'll get my kids back. I don't know. It's like, whatever. That would be funny, but like instead he like has all this passion and love in him. And this also feels like a studio, and Shrek as this feels different because it's like Rumpelstiltskin is voiced by just an animator, which is weird. I didn't know we let those people talk. But Walt Doran, who does Rumpelstiltskin, and it feels odd. I even saw some old reviews from like What the Flick and other people that came out at the time. People at first assume it is like Jack Black or somebody. I actually thought if you had asked me randomly, who do you think it is, I'd feel like probably Zach Galifianakis because it's 2010, or like somebody like, you know, like Jack Black makes sense. And it's not, it's this random dude, and it feels weird because that's not how like Shrek movies work. You're supposed to, it's like all about the name talent, and like I'm not like, you know, you can't do that or something. It feels like they're more casting for like what would make sense for the story or what's the best sounding voice. I'm like, that has never been a Shrek thing. Like they just want fucking names in there. It's like, that feels odd. And even their fairy tales they're bringing up, like when they bring up the Pied Piper, who I learned the guy who does the flute in it is actually, I think, a relative or the son, I think, of the guy who wrote the book Shrek. Or he's a grandson. I forgot to look it up. But he is actually a direct relative of the author of the book of Shrek, which I thought was interesting. A lot of that feels like less concerned. It's like more, it feels like what most franchises do. Like, you know, a movie originally is about a certain thing, and then it, you know, like the Scream movies, it's not 100% about the horror movie stuff. It's about like, you know, what's happening to Sidney Prescott or whatever. And this is more about like Shrek and Fiona and Donkey and Puss in Boots and like all this stuff. Then like Rumpelstiltskin is in there, but is it like saying anything about Rumpelstiltskin? Is it like saying anything about fairy tales? I don't think so. It's like, is it even saying anything about the It's a Wonderful Life thing? Not really. And that is kind of what mixes it up, because I do think the narrative sort of works a lot better in this, but it does what Shrek 3 does, because it messes up what the journey of Shrek should be. But at the same time, it sort of works a lot better. It feels a little more natural. It feels a little understanding the character. Like, yeah, Shrek would get upset that, you know, his life has changed since he had these kids and stuff. And that's like a natural thing for most parents to be like, what the fuck just happened in my life? Like, this kid, there are all these responsibilities. My life used to be easy. I could take a break all the time. Now I can't. And like, that's totally normal. Not to make a deal with Rumpelstiltskin, though, that's weird. But like, or just, like, I needed to blow off steam from both parents, by the way. And it is because, you know, Shrek and stuff is sounding very male-centric. But, and I think culturally, and especially if you look at reviews at the time, people were sort of over Shrek at this point. Like, a lot of reviews were bringing up, like, you know, How to Train Your Dragon. Now, that was really good. And, like, the last one came out before there was a Kung Fu Panda, before How to Train Your Dragon. It feels like there was a new DreamWorks coming about, the DreamWorks of the 2010s, where they certainly had a lot of celebrity voices, but it was more about, like, they had Roger Deakins come in to be a visual consultant. Even that you can see they're doing stuff with, like, the sun and light sources in this, which they previously did not do in those other ones. It really doesn't feel as celeb-tastic. It doesn't have, like, Jane Lynch and Christian Shaw and John Hamm, who are very much 2010s kind of celebrities, are in this, but they're not, like, really showcased. In fact, like, I didn't know it was John Hamm until I looked it up after the movie. Like, I don't know. And it feels like they're trying to be new school DreamWorks, but like Shrek is very much of its time, or at least this adaptation did not try to get, I mean, I don't think that story would work, but they didn't work in a way where it would work with the new style. It's like trying to do this story, which I think mostly works, but it's like, it kind of shows you like you needed to do something. Like, it's hard to be begrudgingly raising kids. Like, that's just veers into the emotional problems abuse area, and it's like, I don't know we want Shrek getting that dark, but it does kind of get there, and it's like how he fully appreciates his family and stuff. I think it sort of it does work, actually, and it is funny in places, and it is fun, and it understands the story, and the tone it messes around a bit, but it sort of works. Also, this is directed by Mike Mitchell. Directed a Shrek sequel, an Alvin and the Chipmunk sequel, a SpongeBob sequel, and it's going to direct Kung Fu Panda 4 and Trolls, as well as I actually saw a short film way back in the day, Hive, which I remember liking, and Deuce Bigelow, Mel Gigolo. He has quite a interesting filmography, I guess. I don't know. This one is, I feel like if you really like 1 and 2, if this had been the third one, I think this would have been a good way to cap it off. I kind of think 3 3 was just the worst one. There's no bones about it. I feel like this is a mess that's sort of styles and of things like that. As well as, Tangled came out later this year. Like even Disney's sort of, that's very Shrek influenced. He's doing the Disney thing. DreamWorks seems like it had moved on from its Shrek Shark Tale era. It's just, this feels like there's certain things when you look at long-running franchises like Bond or Godzilla. There's certain ones you're like, people were still watching these? Like, it feels so, when you look at the year, it feels so divorced from the film year. You're a little confused. You're like, oh, I can see them like messing with stuff. It doesn't really work. And it's like when you look at 80s Bond before they get to Dalton, you're like, what the hell is going on with all this? It's like, seems strange and weird. Like, it sort of works in A View to a Kill, but like, and this is like, it feels like an odd mixture that you're like, this shouldn't exist, right? Like, I almost wish like I do oftentimes with some of the so-so Bond movies that like, directors had been swapped, or this happened before this and stuff like that, or even Godzilla movies. And like with this one, I feel that very much. Like if this had been the third one, people would be like, oh, I think the reception would have been more for it. All the big think pieces about Shrek happened with the third one. I noticed with the fourth one, like the IMDb trivia is 3 things. Like the reviewers are just not into it. And I don't think this movie is good enough to change people's minds, but I think maybe they were a little too harsh because people were sort of like sensing that it was over. And I think sometimes when you say that in reviews, people think, oh, you're just like so harping on the style and the time period that you're not appreciating what the film is. I actually thought when I was watching it, was like, this is a weird mixture and it is very different, but I was sort of much more into it. Like Shrek 3, I had a hard time getting through. This I like was into while I was watching it. I don't think it's as much of a kids movie, and I also think like Incredibles does what it does a lot better in terms of like parental like feeling like you want to go back to your past life thing. It's a lot better at going into that as well. This is just I think a kind of way to save face and bring the franchise back a little bit, but it kind of just feels like it can't fully be what Shrek needs to be with this plot line. It's sort of like sometimes you see a thing, it's like, it's not necessarily that it's bad, it's just like, I think it does the best at what it can be, but I don't think like, if someone were like, oh, I like 1 and 2 so much, I would say, yeah, you should cap it off with this, but I don't think you'd return that much. I think it's nobody's favorite Shrek movie. It's like everyone's third favorite Shrek, I guess. And there's not as much nostalgia other than I think the McDonald's cups for this gave people cancer. So if you're one of those people, I guess you remember this one. This is just, it does a good enough job, but it's very hard to be passionate about it. I think that is the thing. It's like the first 2 people really liked. They're of a certain era, but this is like, the Glee Obama era and Shrek showing up. It's just, I feel like it's like a so-so Shrek film out of its time, or an okay to decent Shrek film out of its time, doesn't capture the imagination. I think there is more of a story here. It doesn't sing as well. It's sort of a little more subdued, and I don't think like Shrek is like that. It's not doing the kind of fun, edgy humor, which you could say is good or bad, but I almost think like what the franchise should have become is like commenting on, like parodying its own parody, which like you'd think like going back in on itself, you could do kind of interesting Back to the Future stuff, which just doesn't really do, it's more like Shrek understanding himself as a responsible person, which there's a lot of layers and themes you could get into, which this film sort of doesn't, other than like, hey, you actually did like the life you didn't like, and those are natural kind of emotions. But I think Shrek Forever After like doesn't end the franchise on a whimper. Maybe it ends it on a confident whimper in a way, but I can't imagine watching this with my kids unless they were like super into Shrek. So it feels like a Shrek that is good and decent, but not essential. Like this is not gonna, like Shrek 1 and 2 are constantly on like kids movies lists, And I feel like, the drop off for 3 is like jumping off a cliff or something. So it's like, it's hard to like jump back with 4. It just doesn't have that in terms of quality. And I think it was hard enough to like sequelize this idea anyway, just because it did well. And I get financially they needed it to exist, but artistically and culturally it didn't feel like it was there. And I don't think the quality made you think otherwise. It made you, a lot of people thought it was worse than the third one, which I don't agree with. I think it, or at the time when it came out, although I remember people saying it was a little better, and I agree. I think this was a step in a better direction. It understood the character more and understood what you need from it, but it just doesn't like reinvent it in the right way. It just feels like a subdued, decent story. It's like, okay, that was a solid, I guess, enough entry in the franchise, but it's an entry in the franchise for people who want to watch the franchise, but not the mass market entertainment, huge pop culture zeitgeisty thing that even if you like the second one or not, the first 2 absolutely were. And maybe the third like tumbled under that, and their reaction or overreaction was to not go in that direction as much. But I kind of think like that was a bad instinct. I don't think Rumpelstiltskin had to be voiced by Zach Galifianakis or Will Ferrell or something. It didn't need to be, but they needed to find a real balance for that. And this film doesn't fully get into that. It's like, maybe they should have waited till this era was over and like come around and been able to do it. And sometimes like if you're a major artistic, huge cultural thing, sometimes you sort of gotta wait till the tide turns more in your favor, or you have a good enough idea that is in the correct tide. Otherwise you get these kind of like misbegotten, usually embarrassing things. But I don't think Shrek 4 does. It's kind of like not bad enough to comment on, but not good enough to really revisit unless you're talking about Shrek movies. I don't know if they're gonna do a reanimated on Shrek 4 unless they, I guess people like the third version or something. It's Smash Mouth's not even it. They couldn't even get Smash Mouth. So I had a decent enough time in Shrek 4, and I think it is a step in the right direction, but is a step in the right direction for Shrek's sake, and probably no one outside of Shrek's sake. And in the end, I don't know, a movie that just takes place in the mind of Shrek to everyone who is super into that mind of Shrek, but will never kind of break out from it and say something more about anything that's going on, feels a bit, like a cool, interesting experiment just for those who are really into these. But for everyone else, I guess, they probably won't know donkey about this Shrek. Alright, so if you've seen Shrek Forever After and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.